Let's take a look now at Mesh Extraction and ShadowBox. These are two tools that allow us to create geometry based on masking in ZBrush. So I have this orc model open. It is a single subtool for the body, for the eyes, and for the teeth. And the body has multiple subdivision levels. It's 7 subdivision levels, so it's pretty high resolution. So mesh extraction allows us to mask out areas of the model. So let's say that we wanted to create some kind of tunic on here. What I would do is I would mask out the area that I wanted to extract. Now, your masking is only going to be as sharp as the underlying geometry. So it's sort of like polypaint. Polypaint adds color to the model, and the polypaint is only going to be as sharp as the underlying geometry you're adding that polypaint to. So keep that in mind when you're drawing these masks. So basically, I'm just going to mask out the shape that I want to extract. We'll rotate around to the back and we'll carry this mask up here. Now, I can always step down a couple subdivision levels, and that will make the masking process a little bit faster. And then I can step up my subdivision levels and sharpen the edges of the mask at a higher resolution. So we'll bring this around, just like this. Now I'll step up my subdivision levels with D hotkey. So now I'm up at the highest subdiv, and I'm just going to erase out just a little edge down here along the bottom. And anything that is masked is going to be extracted. Let's clean up this edge here. I'm just going to add to that. Now, if I want to sharpen the edges of my mask, I want to be careful that I don't have extra masking there. It looks like I caught a little bit that I didn't want right there. Control-Alt-Click on the mask will sharpen the edge. And you see it gets quite sharp because we're working with a higher resolution. So let's zoom out. And I will go to Subtool, and at the bottom of the Subtool menu there is an Extract menu, and if I open that, I can set my surface smoothness and my thickness. I can make it double-sided. If I turn that off, it's just single-sided. I can turn the corner quads to triangles, but typically I don't turn that on. I leave that turned off, and we can have a thin border around our extraction. So I'm just going to click Extract, and what this does is it creates a preview mesh of what our extraction will be, and I can see that my thickness is too high. So what I'll do is I'll take my thickness and set this to 0.005. Hit Enter, and then I will extract again, and once again it will create a preview mesh. This is not the final extraction, it's a preview, and that's much thinner, that's better. I will click Accept. Now that creates a new subtool. I'll clear the masking, and we'll solo it, and you can see that's our extraction. And if we go into frame mode with Shift F, you can see it has picked up the polygroups on the mesh it was extracted from, plus it's polygrouped the inner shell, the thickness, and the outer shell. So if we go back to the body, clear that mask, you can see the polygrouping, it's picked up there. Now, if I were to create negative spaces in this, maybe I wanted to erase out of the mask right here and erase out of the mask right here, and then create another extraction. Just click Extract. It will once again micro polish and create, and then click Accept. I've now created a new extraction, and this extraction has those negative spaces. Now, I can make an extraction without adding thickness. If I go back to the ogre and then take my thickness and set this to 0, and then click Extract, Accept, there we go, clear the mask, and you see it's created that extraction, but there's no thickness to it. So now, the easiest thing to do is you could sculpt on this, but it's going to be quite dense because of how dense the mesh was we extracted the mesh from. What I like to do is retopologize this. Now, I could keep this pretty dense if I wanted it to be like a form-fitting garment. I could smooth out some of the surface details. But what I'd like to do is go to Geometry, Z-Remesher, and we'll Z-remesh this. So currently it's 300,000 faces. We will set this to 10,000 faces and Z-remesh. Make sure our X symmetry is turned on and turn on Z-remesher. Now Z-remesh will process, and it should simplify and retopologize this surface into something that's a bit more workable. It's a great way to start blocking in armor, is to mask out areas, remesh them, and then you can build armor from that. So there you go. You see that we have retopologized this now. If I go to Shift F, you can see our underlying topology. I could smooth this out if I wanted to take away some of those details. Maybe we just wanted to remove the underlying skin details. Now, another way that we can do this is if I undo that smoothing, go to deformation, polish by features, we'll turn that on, and then turn up the polish by features slider, and that will just polish everything. Now, if we want to add a thickness, we go to geometry, we go to geometry, dynamic subdivision levels, turn on dynamic subdivisions, and then we can turn on thickness. Let's turn thickness up, and then that gives us a thickness to this mesh. So if I turn this slider up, I can adjust how thick the resulting geometry will be. We can turn post subdivision on or off, and that will change the type of edging we get on that mesh. If it's turned off, it's added before the subdivisions. If it's turned on, it's added after. Now we will go ahead and click apply, and that generates an actual subdivision set for that. There's 3 subdivision levels on that extraction. So if we turn off solo, and let's turn off those other 2 extractions, you can see we have our costume element here now. So I can take my move brush, and then I can start adjusting the shape, and we're able to start a costume element right here just using mesh extraction. And of course, I could apply cloth dynamics to something like this. I could use the cloth brushes, or I could treat this like a piece of armor, step down my subdivision levels, and it's a bit easier to work with it. I can smooth things back and continue adjusting. Now, if we go to our other extraction, we'll turn off the first extraction, so we're just seeing this one now. And once again, I can Z-remesh this. This one does have thickness. I can clear the polygroups by going to the subtool menu, go to the tool menu and go to polygroups. Let's close these menus so we can see it easier. Go to polygroups and click group visible. And that will group my visible polygroups, or I can go to group by normals, turn that button on, and group by normals, and that should give us a grouping. It's going to take a minute to process because it's a pretty thick mesh. And that gives us grouping based on the surface normals. So if I Control-Shift-Click, you see that it's grouping this based on surface normals. Let's turn off frame mode so we can see this a bit better. So group by normals, we can change our settings here. If I turn the button back on, group by normals again, I'm just going to do a quick save here. Go back into frame mode, and you can see that that has now given us a better polygrouping where we have the outer shell, the inner shell, and the thickness polygrouped separately. Then once again, if I wanted to go to deformation, I could polish by features to take away some of the surface detail. This works more aggressively if you turn that button on, and that will take away those interior details. I can polish by groups, and that polishes the polygroups individually. And again, that has a more aggressive effect if you turn on the button. Now I can go back to Z-remesher, and we can retopologize this. We can elect to keep our polygroups if we want, and Z-remesh. And this will start to process. We get our bar up here telling us the progress as it goes. Incidentally, there is an entire chapter just on Z-remesher where we go into these settings in depth. I just find that mesh extractions are much easier to work with if I use a Z-remesher on top of it, so I can change the poly order, layout, and poly count. And there we go. So this is a great way to start costume elements or new subtools. That's mesh extraction. Mesh extraction is basically anything that you mask, you can extract into a new piece of geometry. Now, There's another tool that uses masking to generate geometry, and that tool is called ShadowBox. So if we go to the shield here and turn off solo, this shield was created using the gizmo and primitives as well as the deformers in another chapter. I want to create a sort of pattern that we can conform to the surface of the shield, like just sort of a radial design like you might see on a Greco-Roman shield. So let's take a look at how to do that now. So we're going to use ShadowBox to create a masking object that we can then project onto this shield. Now, ShadowBox is found under Lightbox, Tool menu, and open up ShadowBox. In the ShadowBox, we have three different tools here. We have a PSD file, which is a background texture that we can use on the ShadowBox. We have ShadowBox 64 and ShadowBox 128, and those are just two different resolutions. I'm going to load up ShadowBox 128, and here you can see we get a box with back, right, and bottom illustrated with that texture file. Now, I'll turn off perspective, because it's easier to work with ShadowBox if we don't have perspective turned on. And I'm going to look straight down the Z-axis, and I am going to start masking here. So we'll just go ahead and hold down the Control key, so we're painting a mask. And I'll just make a mask like this. Now, as soon as I finish painting my mask, you see it's generated geometry based on that mask. I'll turn on transparency, so it's going to be easier to see the shadow box through the object. So that's the back view. That's the first profile. If I erase out of this profile with Control-Alt, I can cut a hole in it. If we go to the right view, maybe I want to make this wider. So I'm just going to hold down the Control key and I'm going to mask a bigger shape here. Now this shape is larger than the first profile that I drew. Now you see it has extended it to fit that profile, but notice it hasn't carried itself up to the edges of this mask. That's because that mask is limited by this mask. If I were to erase out of this mask, I can cut another negative space like that. You can see the effect that that has. Now, if I'm happy with that geometry, I will go to Geometry and I will open the ShadowBox submenu and I'll just turn off ShadowBox, and now that gives me actual geometry. If we go into frame mode, you can see that it looks similar to a Dynamesh mesh. Then I could carry on sculpting this. I could take my trim dynamic brush, for example, and knock out planes on here, or I could take my clip brushes. Let's go to B for brush, C for clip, and we'll select the clip curve brush. Hold down Control Shift. Oops, B for brush, C for clip, clip curve. There we go, to say OK. And then Control Shift, click and drag, and then that gives us our clip brush here. Each time I press the Alt key as I draw this curve, I can add a knot and change my curve direction. If I press the space bar, I can move the curve. Anything on the feathered edge will be clipped away. And you can see we can start to sharpen these edges. I'll do the same thing here. If I want to create a hard edge, I just double tap the Alt key and that creates a hard angle. And I can clip that side. If I want to clip this circle, I'll go to B for brush, C for clip, and I'll go to clip circle center. Click OK. And then if I Control Shift click drag, it creates this circle like this. You want to make sure that that crosshair doesn't overlap the object. If I hold down the Alt key, it will clip out that circle. So it gives me a much nicer effect. If I go to B for brush, C for clip, and go to clip circle normal, we'll skip that note. Now when I draw my circle, I can change its sort of scaling. And if I mouse over the object itself while I have that crosshair over it, it actually inserts a little cylinder shape there. So that's the effect it has when you cross over it with that crosshair. So I'm going to rotate this, and I'm going to draw my clip circle again, hold down the Alt key, and there we go. So we can sharpen those shapes up. If I want to create another shadow box, come over here and I can change my resolution. I can turn this up if I want to. Click shadow box, and now that generates a shadow box based on that geometry. If I clear the masking, the geometry goes away. So here with this brand new shadow box, I will go to transform. I'll turn on symmetry. down the z-axis, and I will turn on R for radial with a count of 8, and that gives me this radial symmetry here. Now I can use my masking brush, hold down the Control key, and I can click and draw a mask like this. Turn on transparency, and you see it's generating geometry based upon that masking. If I clear my mask, it goes away. So let's go ahead and draw some shapes here. Something that would just be pretty and interesting to apply to a shield. Do something like this. And we can Control Alt to erase out from our mask to change the negative shapes or sharpen edges. Now your masking is only ever as sharp as the underlying geometry, and in the case of ShadowBox, that's the resolution. So let's put negative spaces here. And I quite like this almost floral quality that this has. Let's bring these out like this. No, I don't like that. I'm going to undo that stroke. I think it's a little bit prettier like this. Now I've used this a lot to add details to like a cuirass. That's the sort of decorative chest piece in Roman armor. I've used that a lot to create shapes like that. So here I'm just going to mask these out. Now you see I'm losing geometry in this area. That's because my resolution isn't high enough here on the shadow box to capture that. But that's fine. I'll just turn my brush size up a little bit and just turn these up. And I want to make the inside a little bit more ornate, so let's go ahead and erase out of these areas here. And this is almost elvish in its sort of floral, leafy qualities. Let's bring these all into a center circle here. There we go. Now I'll turn off ShadowBox, and I have actual geometry. Now we want to clean this up. It's too thick and too sort of goopy on the front faces, so I'll go to the side and go to B for brush, C for clip. Select the clip rectangle brush, hold down Control, Shift, click and drag, and then I can clip it down to this thickness here, and that tends to sharpen everything up a little bit. Now I can further sharpen up these shapes if I go to B for brush, C for clip, and grab my clip circle brush. Clip circle allows me to do another clip like this. Now I hold the space bar to move this around, and then hold down the Alt key, and I can clip away that circular shape, just like so. Oops, I just turned that into visibility. So Control, Shift, click, drag, hold down the Alt key, and then that will carve away, as it were. There we go. Maybe I want to clean up these curves here. So I'm going to hold down the Shift key, click, and then let go of Shift to drag this around the Z-axis. Now I can draw this clipping circle again, and we'll do something like this. Maybe we will clip this. I'm going to rotate that like this, and then clip like this. There we go. That's much better. Hold down the Alt key, and there we go. Now, that center crosshair, if I bring that into the mesh when I clip, it's going to actually insert sort of a cylindrical shape there. It adds geometry rather than clipping it away. Now, we have a whole chapter that talks about the clipping brushes in relation to hard surface, so this isn't the only time that we talk about this. This does come up again, but we're just using it here to clean up this particular shape. So don't worry, if you have not seen that video yet, we talk about this much, much more. It's I find it best when I'm teaching ZBrush to go ahead and touch on tools that we will go into in more depth later on, because it's all cumulative. Everything works together, and you get the best out of it if you're exposed to these tools in ways that they actually apply. There we go. That's all becoming quite pretty, almost Art Nouveau in its styling. And I like these little face shapes I see there. So I've cleaned this up now. Now I could retopologize this. I could dynamesh this. We could do anything we want to this. It is actual geometry. But what we're going to do is go back to our shield. I am going to go to Subtool, Append, and I'm going to append that shape into the sphere, the shield. Select it, go to Transpose, move it off, and scale it down so it sits just over the front face of the shield here. There we go. Now I can turn off my my radial symmetry, and I'll turn off symmetry entirely with the X hotkey, and then turn off frame mode and turn off transparency. So now you see we've got our extraction from ShadowBox sitting right on top of the shield but not touching it. Now this is fantastic. The next tool is B for brush, M for match, matchmaker right here. The matchmaker brush conforms your current subtool to any subtools underneath it. So I'm going to turn off visibility on the outer ring. I want to conform this shape to the shield underneath like this. It defaults to the drag rectangle stroke, which is what we want. Click on the mesh we want to project, our current subtool, drag off and let go on the background. And look what that does. It conforms it to the surface underneath. So now we take transpose and we can countersink it perfectly into the surface, and it is an absolute perfect match. Now I would go back to Q key to exit out of transpose, and let's give this a material. We'll make this gold, go to material, color, fill object, and then we'll change back to basic material too. So now I have a gold inlay sitting on that shield. Pretty neat. So let's take a look at how we can make another one, and that will interplay with this particular extraction here. What I'll do is I will duplicate this ShadowBox extraction, and I'm going to go to the geometry menu, and once again I'm going to create another ShadowBox. Let's turn our resolution up this time so we get a lot more detail. And I will click ShadowBox. Now that will create a ShadowBox based upon the geometry that I had open before. And you see it's kind of soft, so I'm going to zoom out just with the F for focus key. And just to make life easier, let's turn off visibility on these other tools for right now. The ShadowBox is selected, clear my masking. Turn my symmetry back on, and we can go back to transform and turn on Z symmetry and turn radial back on to get our radial symmetry. Now, if I want to use that other piece as a guide, I can turn it on, and I'm just going to press the 2 key just so I'm not on the matchmaker brush anymore, because then you can accidentally matchmake the ShadowBox, which is kind of inconvenient. So I'll turn on transparency so I can see through that subtool. So that subtool is not affecting the ShadowBox at all. The ShadowBox is my active tool. I just want to mask based on what I have in that other subtool. So I'll zoom in here, and I'll start drawing my mask with the Control key. And I get something like that. And maybe we'll create another little squiggly bit coming out this way, and then make a circle like that. So we can have something along these lines. Now, if I don't like the resolution of this, I can just exit out of ShadowBox. I can turn my resolution up even higher. Turn ShadowBox back on. Now it's going to be a little slower this time because we have very, very dense topology. What it's doing, it's looking at this and then turning that into a new mask. Clear the mask. Zoom back in. Now watch what happens with our masking. We get a much, much finer mask. I have to bear down a little bit more on my brush. There we go. We get a much, much finer mask. So clear that, and let's look at our design and think what would be nice. So I think it'd be nice to do something that looks like vines coming out of the center. So we'll do something that's a little squiggly and meandering. And then maybe it's squiggles like this going around the outer border. That's kind of neat in and of itself. Turn off ShadowBox, and we have our piece. We will limit it again with B for brush, C for clip, clip rectangle, Control, Shift, click and drag, just to thin that down, just like so. Now I will transpose, move this forward. And this time, what I will do is I will go to my go to deformation, and let's turn off transparency, and let's turn on solo so we're only looking at this piece. I can manipulate this shape further by going to, say, polish by features, turning that on, and then polishing by features, and that will smooth things down a little bit more aggressively. We can polish entirely just by using the polish slider. We can polish crisp edges. Again, if you turn this on, it's much more aggressive. You see that will take down those crisp edges. We can polish by groups. This is automatically going to have polygroups on it based on its surface faces and thickness. So take polish by features way up. If I turn that back on, you can see the difference in the effect. It's nowhere near as pronounced with that turned off. Okay, so now let's go ahead and match make this again. I will go to my tools and I will turn on the shield and the piece that we already created. And I'm going to go to frame mode. Now, this is not super dense, so I'll probably add another subdivision level just with Control D to give us a little bit more geometry, because I want to match make this across two objects and I want it to conform to both of them. So I'll go to B for brush, M for match, select matchmaker. Let's go to transform. If you have your symmetry turned on, it will like quadruple up the effect. So it's not really necessary to have that turned on. So you see what that does. It's not the end of the world, but oops, look at that. That's interesting. Down there where I didn't quite get my stroke far enough out, let me undo that. And we'll do it again. That's the importance of getting the stroke all the way out. So click drag so it covers the entire object, then let go. Now look what we get. It transforms to match the shape beneath it that's visible, both the first bit of gold and the underlying shield. I'll take my transpose gizmo, bring this down in the Z-axis, and then that will sit perfectly on that surface. Maybe I want to move this up just a tiny little bit, bring it up like that so it's sitting on top. And then we can further sculpt on this if we wanted to smooth this, say, to take down some of the jaggy edges. We could do that. I'll step down a subdivision level now. And then we can smooth that back so it's not quite so jagged. And we can further adjust its positioning, whatever we think is best. Then I can change this material. Maybe we'll make this shiny. Go to Material, Color, Fill Object. Then we'll change back to Basic Material 2. And there we go. We've got two different materials, two different extractions lined up against one another. Now, if you've watched the video on Booleans, you'll know that you can actually do Booleans in ZBrush. So let's say, for example, I want to select this ShadowBox object here. If I make this a Boolean subtract object from the shield, watch what happens when I turn on Live Boolean. That now subtracts from the object underneath, but leaves the material. Let me turn off the other piece. Look at that. You don't have to just make that an additive shape. This can be a negative shape. If I turn on frame mode, you can see it's still there. It's just a Boolean object. Now, once again, Booleans have their own chapter in my series, so be sure to watch that to learn much, much more about Booleans. But I just wanted to show you this because it's a great way to use this. I can countersink this deeper. As it goes in and starts to intersect with the mesh, we get the surface of the shield again. If I scale this out in either direction, we can change that. So again, you can get really nice complex forms like this. If we turn back on this piece, maybe we'll make this a subtraction. Look at that. Now this one is subtracting. And if I go to my transpose tools on that, I can push that in deeper. I can scale that one and change the effects. So I'm currently on the gold one. I'll go to the silver one now. And let's change that depth and change that thickness. So there's no limit to what you can come up with using these tools together. That is the mesh extraction and ShadowBox and Matchmaker. So I hope you've enjoyed this look at how these tools work together. I think it's some of my favorite things to use in ZBrush, especially when I'm doing costume elements or hard surface tools. I think that they're just really lots of fun. And I've used the Matchmaker extensively for armor, shields, even some environmental stuff. So it's limited only by your imagination and ingenuity. So let's turn the outer border of that shield back on so we kind of get our whole look again. So that concludes this look at ShadowBox and mesh extraction. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thanks for watching.